And here we are for our final lecture of the semester, and this one is on sleep. So about 2/3 of adults in developed nations do not get the recommended 8 hours of sleep a night, and that sleep deprivation comes with real consequences. It destabilizes your immune system, and it more than doubles your risk of developing cancer. It increases your chances of developing Alzheimer's disease, and even moderate disruptions of sleep for a week can disrupt your blood sugar levels to such an extent that you get classified as pre-diabetic. Sleep deprivation increases your risks of cardiovascular disease, of stroke, of congestive heart failure. It exacerbates all major psychiatric conditions, including depression and anxiety and suicidality. It upregulates the hormone that makes you feel hungry. It downregulates the hormone that makes you feel full. And drowsy driving causes hundreds of thousands of traffic accidents every year. And astoundingly, drowsy driving kills more people than driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs combined. But sleep is weird. When you're sleeping, you can't gather food, you can't find a mate and reproduce, you can't take care of your offspring, you're vulnerable to predation. So it's interesting to think about why sleep hasn't been selected out. All animals that live for more than a few days show evidence of a circadian, that is a daily rhythm. And it's not just associated with when you want to be awake and when you want to be asleep, but also preferences for the times of eating and drinking, for mood, core body temperature, metabolic rate, several hormones. And this pattern has been recognized in plants as early as the 1700s. There was a geophysicist studying the ways in which leaves track the sun across the sky during the day. And he was particularly interested in this plant called Mimosa pudica because its leaves follow the sun across the sky, and then at night they collapse like they're wilted, like they don't have enough water, but they pop up again in the morning. And wondering what the trigger for this was, he put some plants outside and the leaves did what they were supposed to do. They tracked the sun across the sky at night, and then they across the sun across the sky during the day, and then collapsed at night. Then he put the plants inside a sealed box, so they had no access to sunlight-driven cues, and the plants continued to do the same thing. They had perky, expanded leaves during the day, which tracked the sun across the sky, even though they had no direct access to the sun, and then they collapsed at night. This is an internal clock. The plants behaved in the same way in the absence of external cues. So we just want to show you this. This is what these plants look like as they track across the day. This is obviously a sped up video of showing these plants. And then as the sun goes down, the leaves begin collapsing. So we see this pattern in plants, but we see it in animals as well. So a relatively early experiment on this was conducted in the 1930s by Nathaniel Kreitman and his student Bruce Richardson. And what they did was they took 6 weeks worth of food and water into Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, which you can see a photograph of here. And it is a cave that is so deep that no sunlight penetrates. And so they recorded their body temperatures and their waking and sleeping patterns for the 6 weeks that they stayed in this cave. They took with them 2 beds, and they put the legs of each of the bed in buckets of water so insects wouldn't crawl on them during the night. And they tracked their patterns of sleeping and waking in the absence of external cues. Interestingly, neither man moved into a random or erratic pattern of sleeping and waking. Richardson, who was in his 20s, developed a day of about 26 hours. And Kleitman, who was in his 40s, developed a day of slightly more than 24 hours. Both of them slept for about 9 hours straight each day. So, absent external cues, they both followed an internal circadian rhythm that approximated, but only approximated, the 24-hour day of our planet. This experiment has now been rerun a bunch of times, more often in buildings, in basements of buildings that house psychology departments rather than in caves, but a similar sort of setup where people are divorced from external cues, and humans average out at about 24 hours and 15 minutes. So a human's free running day averages about 24 hours and 15 minutes in the absence of cues. And so one of the things that we have to do, given the planet that we live on, is reset ourselves to 24 hours rather than 24 hours and 15 minutes, because to keep us in line with the daily rhythm of the actual planet. And the part of your brain that does this is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And so you can see it right there sitting above the optic chiasm in the brain. So it sits there and samples the light that's being sent back from your eyes through the optic nerve to the optic chiasm back into your brain. And so it samples that information about the light regime as that information is being sent back into your brain. It's a tiny, tiny little part of your brain. It's only got about 20,000 neurons in a total brain of about 100 billion neurons, but it influences a vast array of behaviors and physiological processes. So even though all humans keep to a 24-hour pattern, there's variability in the details of the pattern. And one of the ways that people systematically study sleep is with a polysomnography. So this is poly for multiple signals, somnus, sleep of those multiple signals, and graphy to graph the patterns of the signals. And so what people do is measure 3 main things in the patterns of sleep. They record brainwave activity, eye movement activity, and muscle activity. And so the first famous example of recording sleep in this fashion was done in the 1950s by Eugene Aserinsky, who was the graduate student of Nathaniel Kleitman, our friend from the cave. Aserinsky was recording how, when he watched infants sleep, their eyes would move rapidly under their eyelids, but not consistently across the whole sleep period, just for some of it. And electrodes recording brainwaves were showing the most activity during those active eye movement periods. And those periods were bracketed by periods of quiet in both the eyes and the brain. And this pattern repeated across the night. Aserinsky brought these observations to his advisor, Kleitman, who was skeptical in the way of good advisors, and they replicated the work with Kleitman's infant daughter, which would now not pass human subjects review, but this was the 1950s and the rules were slightly different. And this begins our modern understanding of sleep cycles and the way they are patterned. And this is what you can see on the screen. We divide sleep patterns into cycles, which go through a series of regularized steps. So in non-REM sleep, REM standing for rapid eye movement, in the non-REM phase of sleep, in stage 1, your eyes are closed, you are relaxed, but it's pretty easy to wake up. This period lasts for between about 5 and 10 minutes. In stage 2, you're in light sleep, your heart rate slows down, your body temperature drops. And this lasts for between 10 and about 25 minutes. And then in stages 3 and 4, you are in deep sleep. You are hard to wake up. If you are awoken, you will feel disoriented. And really important stuff happens in this stage. Body repair happens, building of muscle and bone happens, revitalization of your immune system happens. And then about 90 minutes after you initially fall asleep, you enter a period of REM sleep, of rapid eye movement sleep. You have several of these periods of REM across the night. The first one is typically about 10 minutes long, and they get up to about an hour by the end of the night. And so during REM sleep, your heart rate goes back up, your breathing rate increases, you often have intense dreams, your brain is highly active in ways that can be seen on brain scans, and importantly, all your muscle activity is suppressed, so you don't act out dreams, which is good news for anyone you share a bed with. Now, why is the pattern like this? We don't have an exact answer, but the best hypothesis on the table at the moment is that non-REM sleep, those first 4 phases, sort out neural connections made during the day and discards the unimportant. And then REM sleep consolidates the important memories, the important ones, into long-term memory. So early in the night, there's a lot of sorting out to be done. And later in the night, there's a lot of consolidation to be done, which would explain why the REM phase is longer in the later phases of sleep than the early phases of sleep. Interesting is that we do way more REM sleep than the other great apes do. We spend about 20 to 25% of our sleeping time in REM, whereas the other great apes, so the chimpanzees, the bonobos, the gorillas, the orangutans, only spend about 10% of their night in REM sleep. Now, there really are morning people and night people. Morning people are about 40% of the population, evening people are about 30% of the population, and the remaining 30% sit somewhere in between. And this pattern seems to be driven at least somewhat by genetics. You can move people a little bit in the same way as you can move time zones to overcome jet lag, but it's so reliably set by sun-driven light regimes that they're hard to move very much at all. There is a hard-to-test evolutionary hypothesis about this, which suggests that having someone in the group awake to watch out for saber-toothed cats or whatever almost constantly, so having some of your population be morning people and some of your population being evening people, may actually be useful. This is a tricky idea to test, but it's an interesting idea. In utero, the fetus spends almost all the time in a sleep-like state. The things that pregnant people perceive as kicks seem to be the result of the kind of brain activity typical of REM sleep. In adults, those kinds of movements are suppressed during REM, but they don't seem to be in fetuses. And it's not until the 3rd trimester that the fetus spends any real time awake. And when they do, it's only for about 2 to 3 hours a day. So that suprachiasmatic nucleus does its job by stimulating the pineal gland to start releasing melatonin soon after dusk. Melatonin itself doesn't generate sleep. It just announces to the rest of the brain that it's time for sleep. And once you are asleep, the concentration of melatonin slowly decreases across the night, and as light through your closed eyelids begins stimulating your brain, your pineal gland stops releasing melatonin. Just a side note on melatonin, it's become a very popular sleep aid. One of the things you want to be careful about with melatonin is that because it is considered a supplement and not a drug, it isn't regulated by the FDA. And in tests of over-the-counter melatonin supplements, there has been a vast diversity of melatonin concentrations found in those pills. Some of them have almost no melatonin in them at all. Some of them have a great deal more melatonin in them than is on the box. So you want to be a little bit careful messing around with melatonin. So your suprachiasmatic nucleus, by stimulating the pineal gland, is keeping your circadian rhythm in check. When you are jet lagged, when you have got on a plane and flown to a new time zone, your poor suprachiasmatic nucleus can only adjust you about an hour a day. So jet lag takes some time to get over. Now, you might have noticed, if you've done a lot of long-haul flying, that jet lag is worse when you fly east than it is when you fly west. If you are flying east, it means you are trying to shrink your day. So you would go to bed earlier than you would otherwise. And going to bed and going to sleep earlier than you would otherwise is a very difficult thing to muscle your way into. Flying west means you need to go to bed later than you would ordinarily have, which is something you can consciously try to do. And also recall that everyone's free running day is slightly longer than 24 hours, which means that it's biologically easier for you to expand your day than it is to shrink it. Now, occasional exposure to jet lag is physiologically demanding, but it's not a long-term stressor. But people who are chronically exposed to jet lag suffer real biological consequences. Studies of airplane crews who routinely fly long-haul routes and have little time to recover between flights end up with the parts of their brain devoted to learning and memory literally becoming smaller over time in ways that you can measure on a brain scan, which suggests that the brain cells are actually killed by the biological stress of time zone travel, and their short-term memory is measurably impaired. In addition, both air crews and shift workers who suffer from jet lag without going anywhere have higher rates of cancer and type 2 diabetes over controlled matched subjects from the general population. So it is useful to think of there being a sleep pressure that builds up over time and increases your desire to sleep. There's a chemical called adenosine that increases in your brain every moment that you are awake. You can think of it as a clock ticking, measuring up how long you have been awake. The more adenosine there is in your brain, the more you are going to want to go to sleep. There is an almost irresistible concentration of adenosine built up in your brain in most people between about 12 and 16 hours of being awake. You can, however, mute the signal, and you can mute it with caffeine. So caffeine is one of the most widely used and widely abused psychoactive stimulants in the world. And it represents one of the longest and largest unsupervised, unplanned drug trials ever conducted on humans, rivaled perhaps only by alcohol. Now, adenosine works by binding to receptors in your brain. Caffeine interferes with its action by binding to the same sites. So it competes with your adenosine. So it blocks the signal of the adenosine getting to your brain. Now, caffeine is complicated though because of its half-life. The half-life of a drug is the amount of time it takes for your body to metabolize and remove 50% of the drug that you put into your body in the first place. Caffeine has a half-life of between about 5 and 7 hours, depending on your individual biochemistry. So just for comparative purposes, to get you thinking about half-lives, ibuprofen has a half-life of about 2 hours. Alcohol has a half-life of about 4.5 hours, although that's very variable. Morphine has a half-life of between 2 and 4 hours. Penicillin has a half-life of about 45 minutes. So if you have a cup of coffee after dinner, say at 7:30 p.m., then 50% of that caffeine is still hanging out in your brain, interfering with the action of the adenosine at 1:30 in the morning. And there's nothing particularly magic about that 50% marker. It's still plenty of caffeine to interfere with your sleep. Note also that decaffeinated coffee does not mean non-caffeinated coffee. Typically, decaf has between about 15 and 30% of the caffeine that is in regular coffee. The variability in half-life between people seems to be largely genetic. Caffeine is degraded by an enzyme in your liver, and different versions of that enzyme have different efficiencies. The way this works also explains why people often crash hard when the coffee wears off. That adenosine that is being prevented from interacting with the receptors in your brain isn't going away. It's continuing to build up in your brain. And so in the absence of caffeine, it floods back over all of those receptors and activates them, prompting sleep. Now, the WHO has called sleep deprivation a global health epidemic. And importantly, most of the people who do not get the recommended amount of sleep don't report wanting less sleep. They just report not getting it. Almost 60% of people in the West attempt to pay off the sleep debt they incur during the week over the weekends. But biology doesn't work like that. Your brain can never recover all the sleep it's been deprived. We can't accumulate a sleep debt without incurring a biological penalty, and we can't fully pay it back later. So I want to think now about sleep deprivation in different segments of society, and we're going to start with medical training. So it's widely accepted that when you're doing your residency as part of your training to become an MD, you'll work very long consecutive hours and live in a perpetual state of sleep deprivation. A recent study showed that being awake for 18 hours produces the same kind of cognitive impairment as being drunk does. So why did we decide that this was a good way to go about training doctors? This all starts with a man called William Stewart Halsted in the 1880s. He founded the surgical training program at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. He was the chief of the Department of Surgery, so he had mountains of power over how things were done. And he had some very particular ideas about how doctors should be trained, including a 6-year residency in which he believed that doctors should actually reside, hence residency, in the hospital to allow them to be fully committed to their training. Now, Halsted regarded sleep as a dispensable luxury that took away from concentration on work and learning. And even if the residents in training were in any position to complain, which they obviously were not, it would have been difficult to argue with a man who practiced what he preached. He had an extraordinary ability to stay awake for days without showing any signs of fatigue. It was only after his death that it was discovered that Halsted was a cocaine addict, which explains both the slight madness of his training program and his apparent ability to function without sleep. Halsted had been working on anesthetics for surgical procedures and soon began experimenting on himself, which rapidly led to a cocaine addiction. And so it's the system that Halsted set up and that we have inherited and continue to make doctors in training suffer through and continue to put patients at risk as they're cared for by sleep-deprived people. The most recent regulations in the US governing what doctors in training can do in terms of their work schedule is that doctors are allowed to work no more than 80 hours a week and no more than 24 consecutive hours. And these are the improved rules. This was making it better. And as you can see, this is still a wildly inadequate protection of the doctors in training themselves and the patients with whom they are interacting. So we have a strange societal valuing of people who deprive themselves of sleep. We think there's something admirable about the person who is working at 1 a.m. and then is back again at work at 6 a.m. And we have come to expect it of each other. But if you are, for example, a CEO running a company, that sleep deprivation comes with real costs in the kinds of performance metrics that CEOs tend to care about: creativity, intelligence, motivation, effort, efficiency, effectiveness when working in groups, as well as emotional stability and honesty. You can run experiments on this, in which you give participants the ability to choose between work tasks that require different levels of effort. From easy, listen to some voicemails, to difficult, design a complex project that requires thoughtful problem solving and creative planning. Participants who slept in the preceding days consistently choose the least difficult tasks, things that require less concentration and less creativity. Now, it's possible that this is correlation and not causation. That is, people with the personality traits that incline them to take the easy way out are the same people who are disinclined to prioritize getting enough sleep. But if you take the same individuals and run the experiments once they've had a full night's sleep, and then again when they've been sleep deprived, you get the laziness effect. Interestingly, too, is that people tested in this fashion who have been shown to exhibit the sleep deprivation-induced laziness do not perceive themselves as having done so. They seem unaware that they're less interested in taking on the challenging tasks. NASA has been very interested for a long time in the effects of sleep, and they have found that napping is tremendously helpful for their astronauts. Naps as short as 26 minutes have produced a 36% improvement in task performance and a 50% increase in alertness. And this has produced a nap culture at NASA, even among the non-astronauts. Obviously, the vast majority of people who work at NASA are not astronauts, but the value of sleep has been seen across all of those groups. Now, how about education? 80% of public high schools in the US start before 8:15 a.m. and almost 50% start before 7:20 a.m. Some of the school buses for those 7:20 a.m. starts begin picking kids up at 5:45 a.m., which means that even the most efficient kids have to get up by 5:30 a.m. Now, teenagers have circadian rhythms that are shifted forward by between about 1 and 3 hours, depending on the individual. So for a teenager, getting up at 5:30 a.m. is like an adult having to get up at 2:30 or 3:30 a.m. And if you were woken up at 3:30 a.m. every day and sent off to work or school, would you be particularly pleasant and motivated and emotionally stable? And this is particularly concerning because adolescence is the phase of life in which you are most susceptible for the development of chronic mental health illnesses like depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia, as well as suicidality. So we're taking some of the most vulnerable people and subjecting them to sleep deprivation, largely for the convenience of adults. Research has shown that delaying the start times of high schools increases class attendance, reduces behavioral problems, reduces psychological problems, and decreases substance and alcohol abuse. It also reduces traffic accidents. The pattern of kids driving to school is something I find deeply weird. Kiwis don't do that, but it is a really common phenomenon in the US. When the Mahtomedi School District in Minnesota changed the start of their school from 7:30 a.m. to 8 a.m., they observed a 60% reduction in traffic accidents amongst drivers aged 16, 17, and 18. When Teton County in Wyoming did a similar sort of thing, changing their start time from 7:35 a.m. to 8:55 a.m., they saw a 70% reduction in traffic accidents amongst drivers aged 16, 17, and 18. So just for some context here, so you get a sense for what a 60% reduction in accident rates really means. When anti-lock brake technology was introduced, it was widely heralded as revolutionary, a massive improvement in public safety in cars. It reduced accident rates by about 25%. So this is important for high school students, but it's important for university students as well. Probably fewer of you are driving to campus, but you are all trying to cram a whole lot of information into your brains really quickly. So we're going to think now about the consolidation of memory and skill. And when we talk about the acquisition of skills as muscle memory, we're really not actually talking about muscles. Your muscles have no capacity to store memories. Those memories are stored in your brains. So, the study took a whole pile of right-handed university students and got them to type a 5-number sequence on a keyboard with their left hand, so typing with their non-dominant hand, as quickly and as accurately as possible. People practiced for 12 minutes, and unsurprisingly, people got pretty good at typing this 5-digit number in there. And then everybody was retested on their skill, their speed, and their accuracy 12 hours later. But there were 2 groups. One group learned the task in the morning and then were retested 12 hours later in the evening. The other group learned the task in the evening, slept overnight, and then were retested in the morning. The awake people, the people who had been trained in the morning and were tested in the evening, showed the same level of performance in the evening test as they had shown in their morning training. So they didn't get any worse, but they didn't get any better. But the sleeping people, the people who were trained in the evening, got sent home to sleep and were retested in the morning, showed a 20% improvement in speed and a 35% improvement in accuracy compared with themselves the previous night. Then, when they took the non-sleeping people who were trained in the morning and tested in the evening, sent them home for a night of sleep and tested them in the morning, they showed the same pattern of improvement in performance. Subsequent work showed that the pattern holds if it's a short sequence of numbers, say 5 numbers, or a long sequence of numbers, 10 numbers. If it's one hand, if it's 2 hands, if it's your non-dominant hand, if it's your dominant hand, it holds. When they had people do this with long strings of numbers, they would consistently stumble at the same place. Different places for different people, but almost no one could get the 10 digits without a pause. That pause would disappear after participants had slept. So it's not practice that makes perfect. It's practice followed by sleep. That's the consolidation of memory. What about learning stuff in the first place? So this is a task looking at, again, college students, which is anytime you read a research article where it says healthy young adults, they mean college students. The students were divided into a napping group and a non-napping group. And so at noon, everyone went through a session of learning 100 pairs of names and faces. So this is a taxing short-term memory task. Then the napping group went off to have a 90-minute sleep in the sleep lab, so with electrodes attached to the head, so hardly the most natural or comfortable of environments, but a nap nonetheless. And then the no-nap group just hung around the lab doing non-taxing activities, browsed the internet, played board games. At 6 p.m., they redid the training session, and then they tested how many name and face pairs the participants could remember. The nappers remembered 20% more name face pairs than the non-nappers did. And this is an ability to add additional information in that second training session at 6 p.m. The short-term memory of the name face pairs is during sleep moved over into long-term memory, making more space to put more name face pairs in the short-term memory. The guy who ran this study describes this like moving the contents of your full USB drive over onto your hard drive, so you've got more space for new stuff. Your short-term memory is a finite resource. You have to clear it out by putting things in long-term memory to put new things in. And it's sleep that clears out that space to make new memories. Now, one of the things that's really important about this is that if you go to bed at midnight and you would typically wake up at 8 a.m., you get your full 8 hours sleep. But if for some reason you have to wake up at 6 a.m., you've lost about 25% of your sleeping time. So there's 2 hours, 25% of your sleeping time. But you haven't lost 25% of your REM time. Because remember, those REM periods of sleep get longer and longer towards the end of your sleep period. So while you're losing 25% of your sleep time, you're losing somewhere between 60% and 90% of your REM time. And so because it's at the beginning of your sleep, that non-REM sleep is sorting out memories and deciding on which ones to discard and which ones to move to long-term storage. And then the REM sleep that's consolidating those memories in long-term storage. So if you are cutting short your sleep, you're doing all of the discarding, but none of the consolidation of the long-term memories. And so if you are trying to learn things, prioritizing sleep and a long enough period of sleep to consolidate those long-term memories to get all of that REM sleep is really, really important. So start prioritizing sleep. It's good for everything.